So let's talk ransomware revenue out there. So some of you may have had to deal with this. The client, obviously, there's cost there. What a lot of people don't also see is the cost at the end of the tunnel, not just what the ransomware actors get if you pay the ransomware, but also it's costly. It takes about a month to restore, even if you get the decryption and all this stuff. It's just a process because they kind of come in and you got to deal with integrity, all this stuff. So let's talk about operators, though. So props to chain analysis on this. I saw this at a thing and I asked if I could borrow this because it's had they do blockchain analysis stuff. So Conti, you might have heard of them. Royal Ransomware, Rebel, all the different things. They play some big versions of the stuff. They hit a lot of those enterprises and things. And so they're probably, last year they made over almost $250 million. Doesn't mean you should go into this business. Just saying, ROI, risk of incarceration. They're out of Russia, so a little bit of a different story there. So we got Conti, they've been playing the big players. And then as you can see, there's Darkside, Phoenix, Rebel, Cuba, Hades, all these things. And they're kind of down there, but they're still it's a big business. There's you can make $50 million, you can make, but you're still in the multi-million-dollar game. Hive is another big one and stuff like that. So this is obviously, this is that slide that says, ransomware is still a problem,
I mean, I'm surprised that Lockbit is not one of the top three because it's been, wrecking havoc everywhere, right? Every week.
Yeah. So Lockbit is kind of Conti plays around, I think, also sometimes. So Lockbit's one of those do-it-yourself kind of models too. So sometimes the groups don't stick to one piece of ransomware. Sometimes they'll mess around. But there's also what's called can't remember the name of it, but basically there's distributors that also handle the payments, and then there's people who write the malware. Right. So there's an entire pyramid that's going down here. So you got your malware coder at the top, all the way down to distributors. And so when like a franchise model, right? So when you're tracking groups, it can get kind of confusing because you can't base it just on the malware itself. You have to base it on a few things: right. The operators, how they operate, who they are, their finances, all that stuff. So it gets a little complicated, but. Right. And it's not always clear as day, right? It usually requires incident response and investigation. So, but yes, Lockbit's kind of a big player. It's becoming even more this year and stuff like that. So we've definitely seen a little bit more of that, I think. Speaking of that, let's talk TTPs, which means techniques, tactics, and procedures for anybody who's new to the Intel world. Essentially, this is just breaking down how ransomware generally works, right? So in general, what ransomware will do is it'll recurse directories, right? And it uses whitelists for DLL and system files, so it ignores those so that it doesn't damage your computer, so they can actually make, when I say damage, it doesn't damage the OS, so that they can make money. Because if they damage your OS and you can't see the ransom node, it would be pointless. Then it opens and reads the file into memory, so it'll open up the files, right? And then it'll run some kind of crypto thing. Sometimes it's native, sometimes it's their own homebrew, sometimes it's some library, Lipsodium, whatever. But they'll do crypt file. And then sometimes there's striping. And I want to explain striping encryption because we're seeing more of it. So in the criminal world, which is really fun, is that it's like our businesses today in a product. So when they sell ransomware, one of the big things is they want it to be fast. We've got terabytes and petabytes of data this day. And imagine if you're trying to encrypt a petabyte of data and you hit one file, it's going to take maybe 2 days to encrypt that file. So what they do is striping, where they'll encrypt, like Lockbit does this. So they'll encrypt sections of the file and skip the rest, and then they'll keep offsets or keep a track of it in the footer so that you understand that it's not the entire file. And this speeds up, even with a multi-petabyte file, they're going to only have 8 stripes in there, and they just pick that and then they just divide that by 16 and go, okay, and there we go, right? So that Lockbit's a great example where it'll encrypt only 4K of an entire file.
So yeah. Just to break it down, if you have a file, let's just say a Word file, they'll only encrypt the first random, or either first or middle or whatever, certain number of bytes. You can see the rest of but enough for that file to crash basically on you. And
usually it encrypts definitely the header, which breaks most files in there, right? So Lockbit usually encrypts 4K. Zeppelin actually has 8 stripes. So if the file's too small, it'll just encrypt the entire file, right? So if it's a 100K file, you won't see anything. But if there's say 10 megabyte file, it'll divide that by 8 and then basically and then in their footers, they'll have offsets of where each stripe starts. And then it keeps track of that so that it can decrypt, right? So it basically essentially will do it that way, right? And this is enough to damage most files, right? We've obviously experienced some things where it's not always enough to damage it, but it's really about speed decisions But what's cool about it is in our cases and stuff like that, we've been able to crack things because of these mistakes or because these demands on the ransomware writers themselves to make it faster. And unfortunately, as you know, when you do features over, functions, sometimes it can cause security problems, right? Look at this cool like padlock.
Right,
Thanks, I
right.
made it out of the clay, right? But I got to the market fast, right? So that's that,
Right.
And then in that encryption, sometimes it'll do it has a static key, which is embedded in there. It's a public key usually, but then sometimes it'll do ephemeral key gen as well. So like Zeppelin will do key gens where it's like one 2048-bit RSA key, and then it'll make these 512 per server in some cases, and obviously sometimes it'll do something else. But essentially, it then takes that 512 for the speed, and then it pops it back and encrypts to the 2048. The reason why is generating public keys can be very slow.
So is it because then every target that they hit, there is a different key, so that they can't just go out on the open market and buy a key like they used to in the
there's
in the
two
90s.
markets, yeah. So like there's two reasons. There's speed again because that's ephemeral key. Two, they can charge per key. So there's like a business model that says, okay, so like in many cases Zeppelin will have multiple servers that get hit. And so then there'll be like extension of this key on this one and a different extension on that and a different one. And so then let's just pretend Zeppelin's like $10,000 a key. And if you got like 10 different like key extensions, they've just made $100,000, right? So like that's also a reason why, and that's why they do it. It's like an opportunity for them. And then after it encrypts, it usually deletes or renames the file, deletes and renames renames the file with the extension, right? So, and they do a pretty good wipe. Like, if you've noticed, if ransomware wasn't good, you would be able to just recover with an undelete program, but they write right over that file. So, and then they write the file to disk, append the footer, which is, a footer or a header, in most cases a footer. So it'll tell you like offset lengths, it'll tell you all the information you need to know to have the encrypted key in there. And that's how like decryptors work. And then on the techniques and tactics of procedures continued, the note, then the ransomware note comes around. Usually it's text, doc, PDF, desktop, screen lock, things like that. So, usually they make it so that you really know that it's there.
Right.
And then exfil and extortion, right? So the big players, Doppelganger, Rebel, and Maze kind of started that game. A lot of variants are actually idle threats. Zeppelin actually says they exfil, but they don't exfil, right? In that case, like Lockbit will, but like Zeppelin actually does. Like if it's just an operator just doing Zeppelin, not like Lockbit or any other pieces like that. Most of the time, usually it's a medium-sized to small business type user for Zeppelin. Usually they'll say we're exfilling, but there's in most cases that I've seen, there's never been a sign of just pure exfil from them because they don't have it written in their software, right? But so it doesn't mean don't take it to heart. You can usually tell the exfil difference when there's actual site and you've seen a history of them exfilling, So then from that point, they'll extort you there. So that's a double opportunity there, not only to decrypt, but also it puts pressure on you to move on paying. And so hiring someone like me, you get into time and time and cost. And like, if you don't get it on time, it gets scary, right? This is why it's always recommended to have forensics involved to check if there is any actual real exfil so that your stress levels either can go up or down. So then network file share enumeration. So it usually scans for open SMB network ports. So if you have open directories, if it has admin access and stuff, it usually gets access to a lot of different directories and it'll encrypt all of that stuff, which, becomes its own pain. And then it'll rinse and repeat, it'll encrypt, rinse and blah, 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 and keep just doing this off the network. So ransomware attack process. So how the heck do they get in? Right. Most days, typically they're getting in these days around RDP, open RDP on a thing without VPN. So if you have open RDPs, assume it's insecure. So, and the reason why is there's always O days for that stuff. There's always a bad configuration, or there's an entire market selling like passwords for RDP, open RDPs. There is literally groups out there that scan RDPs and get passwords for people, and then they sell them to ransomware providers or distributors and stuff. So put those behind like two MFA VPN. Malicious email is another way in. It's like typically targeted. Sometimes sometimes it's not targeted, but most of the time it's a spear phish. Once the breach occurs, it's usually a human at the keyboard, so they'll drop additional payload stuff, hacker, processor, a few other things. They'll start turning off EDR. They'll start doing pen testing. They'll start scanning the network. They'll try to get persistence. Usually before you get hit with the ransomware, they're in there for about 4 to 8 days. Then stuff goes down, right? Privilege escalation. So the biggest thing is their ransomware works great if they have admin privileges, right? Which is not hard these days if they can turn off your EDR and stuff like that, because then you can just PowerShell your way up, right? Data exfil, when that happens, they'll start moving that first, and then they'll do encryption. That way they can, make sure that they have 2 spots there. Then after their data exfil, which can take, that's why, 4 to 8 days, sometimes that takes time. Then ransomware gets dropped, maximizes the damage, exits, and then it's time to collect the loot, at least in their, if I'm not involved.
That's right.
Sorry, that was a joke. You're right. They do pass off. Actually, I see a comment here. They also pass off to pen testers and share the ransom. Yes, that is true.
Right. Exactly. Right. And so in the past, we've talked about tools like Bloodhound and Cobalt Strike and stuff like
Cobalt
that.
Strike
help
is
people.
big time. I saw a recent one that they luckily didn't get hit, but the group uses Lockbit. And we were like, they must have gotten distracted or something because they didn't hit ever run. We were worried if there was a kill chain. And they were literally using Cobalt Strike and a lot of the standard pen testing tools out there, So
tools, absolutely.
Yep. You're right. So and you're right. Ransomware operators may not be the same as the pen testing team. I've seen that in the past too, where it's you'll have one team for offensive getting in and breaching, and then there's the player who's got the payloads, all this stuff. And there's a line of distributed business going on. Everybody's making money along that chain. It's like a partner reseller setup.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Everybody know about ChatGPT. I'm sure you guys have heard of that craze out there. I actually wrote this ransomware code, but this ransomware code can be also written by ChatGPT. So the game is changing a little bit. So essentially, I know this might be hard to say. I'm not sure if it is or not, but essentially, this is just the root core code of how easy it is to create ransomware. This doesn't take much. This is, of course, done in Python. They do it usually in C++ or Delphi or whatever. And it's a little more complicated. But the concept of this is no different than a backup that's using encryption. So it is hard for EDR or any of these things when you write your own new piece of software to encrypt something. Encrypting information is not bad. So you get into this, they're in this gray area where you can't really, that's why ransomware is such a problem. It's not easily detectable because everybody uses AES or everybody uses, there's a lot of pieces that are used. Similar properties exist in many different programs because people are thinking about security and privacy, right? Signal, right? And Messenger has encryption. Well, backups that are, good, providers, might do encryption at rest, right? Things like that. So this is not any different. It's basically ransomware is a backup system. The difference is they have the key and you don't.
I think that's the reason why the SolarWinds ransomware was so bad, because they were using the exact same processes to exfiltrate data that typical.
They were hiding themselves in a DLL side injection and inside some code.
That's right. You're right. It's hard to detect because they mask themselves in as a standard process.
And now that we already have the tools on the web that you can buy if you're not a coder. Now we have ChatGPT that you can actually have it write it for you if you want. If you don't, it's not as easy as you can. It's like ChatGPT. I'm not trying to scare anybody because I actually find ChatGPT also is great, but it's not. It's good for low code pieces here, but it will speed up that development process. It's amazing when you really step back and think about that. A 512 digit number can literally halt an organization. Crypto is one of the best equalizers in the world, but also one of the worst, right? Russia is the prime source of our ransomware attacks. I actually recently am dealing with a Russian. They're getting hit by their own Russian people nowadays. So obviously some chaos is going down in that country right now. They don't see this as criminal. This is kind of part of so this has got political history to it. And I'm not trying to diss Americans and as a Canadian here, but the Western world, we had a Cold War, obviously, with Russia. And when we got them to, become a democracy, it put them out of business. And a lot of the unobjective sciences and stuff ended up becoming a problem, and KGB became the mafia. So there was a lot of crime that they do because of the need to make money, and some people pay for their families. So it doesn't mean it's right, but from the view of what's really going on, it's because of the economic instability of the country, and they hated what we did because we went into a year, said, oh, let's show you how to be democracy, and then we bailed out. And so they're kind of upset with us too. So that's why phishing, ransomware, all that stuff has been targeting. There's actually even sites like In Fraud We Trust making fun of our In God We Trust money because essentially they're upset. There's a combination of resentment and we need to make money. So it's to them, it's not criminal. The only time it's criminal is when they do attack Russia. And that's suddenly a thing. But right now, I'm not calling Putin about this other case. Cyber insurance covers it, as we've seen, forensics, all this stuff. But also continues the problem. If we keep paying for this ransomware, there's no reason anybody will ever stop because they don't even see it as criminal. It's a victimless crime because they're like, oh, well, the cyber insurance is going to cover it. No worries,
Well, so in our audience, we have a few insurance professionals that have joined, cyber insurance professionals that have joined. It's getting more and more difficult to actually, get cyber insurance for this reason, because now cyber insurance companies are asking you to prove that you have proper controls in place,
Oh yeah.
and even the controls that the cyber insurance companies are asking you to put, in my opinion, are 10 years old.
Well, yeah,
Right?
so it's
Like,
called commercial reasonability. So I actually do expert witness
right.
work on this for what's called a law called UCC 4A in banking. But essentially, when people want to sue a bank that's a commercial side and they lost their money to phishing, hacking, whatever, they have to prove that the bank, followed commercial reasonability of today's standards.
Right.
Now, the good news about the cyber insurance is it's old standards, so you probably can still get in. It's still a process. But honestly, the reality is most people do not and cannot keep up with commercial reasonability in security because things are changing constantly, right? And so
Absolutely.
yeah. So which makes it easy cases for me to unfortunately win. But so current defensive options are backups, obviously, but most of the time people don't have them disconnected from the network, right? I've seen this many times with the backups there, but I'm like, oh, they encrypted the backups, right? Cracking keys, possible when lucky. Zeppelin was a luck. Like we got lucky that I even got put in front of me. They attacked a homeless shelter and it ticked me off. And so I paid attention to it. And it had a lot of reviews and no security researchers actually had figured it out because crypto is not necessarily the same as like security research. And it was just lucky that it got in front of somebody that likes crypto, right? But that was luck. Right. So it's like we have insurance companies that pay us to try to break stuff or try to recover, and they'll pay us. And we always tell them, 99% chance we probably won't, but they want to try that 1%. You know what I mean? So it's also costly. It took me a month and a half to figure out the Zeppelin stuff and get the code working and all that. And I'm still fixing code on it sometimes. You got to keep it secret. And it's few and far between, right? Criminal disruption, chain analysis companies like that, they start shutting down illegal BTC exchanges. FBI tries to get attributions and arrests. Again, it's Russia, so it gets kind of, thing. Requires industry law enforcement. Russia is obviously a country that is not in our friend circle right now, at least, and they're currently at war. And then there's endpoint detection and response, EDR, XDR, all these things. They attempt to detect ransomware, but they're obviously not successful. Although I will say this. The attempts of ransomware, based on the statistics, 90% of it doesn't get in. It's 10% that actually is successful. So there is that, but it's still it's that one line of code. It's that one, it still costs,
We say in security, right? Like, it's not about stopping them from getting in, but it's about delaying them. And so hopefully then your other controls kick in where you can detect it while that's happening.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but if you have no control, then there is no delay and they just get in and then wreck havoc
and there's
right
a
away.
huge downstream market. Enterprises got to have a cap limit, right? The Google had Aurora, right? Which wasn't ransomware, but they had got a breach. And then they learn and go, hell, that's not happening again, right? Nothing big, right? Then they start bug bounties. They start doing all the process. Colonial, that's probably never going to happen again, right? Like all these things. So you get the guy hit once and then they got to go downstream, which is easy target markets. SMBs, medium-sized companies just don't have the maturity yet, right? And two, I've even seen like 7,000 person companies and the typical size of a security team is about 10 people. I'm like, you're guarding a castle with 10 security guards? So it's kind of, that's how you have to look at it because you got to see it as a castle. And it's kind of like the euphemism of gunpowder just got invented. So all these castles are stuck and people are firing these cannons at these castles. And it's not, they have no dynamic ability, especially smaller ones, right? Things like that. So, yeah. All right. Story time. In a world where the year is 2020 and everybody had to be stuck inside, which is actually the reason why I probably figured this out. So year's 2020, we get, homeless shelter gets hit. Small and medium businesses were getting attacked by this strain Zeppelin. I call it Dead Zeppelin is my decryptor. It was sold on the dark web. It's do-it-yourself kit. Like I said, they added the Stripe encryption. They made a mistake on the 512-bit ephemeral keys because the Zeppelin developers were struggling to make the ransomware fast. On the dark web, you could see complaints from the customers. So they cut corners for speed, and that then created an opening for me. So I got a call, about this homeless shelter, and I have a rule: don't mess with the homeless. So I looked at it. And essentially what I analyzed was that they had a file encryption. And essentially, they encrypted it with AES 256 CVC mode, which is good. I mean, not good for us, but it's a good cipher. Then they had a key encrypted with RSA, which was a master key in there. And then they encrypted a key stored in an actual file. And then they had an ephemeral key, which was the 512-bit RSA key. They had a private key that was encrypted into that. When you go into that registry, you'll see encrypted key, public key, and then you'll see private key. And then the public key was actually stored in the registry. Now, this took more than just cryptography. It took digital forensics and IR kind of like work too. It took me like 2 to 3 weeks to make sure I could even recover, or I had to write a lot of code to uncarve and try to recover from the registry's deleted keys, because they do remove them. And they're usually hiding in the transaction log or pushed down a bit, right? And it wasn't always perfect. We had like a 98% success rate. But it's not always perfect, right? If you have a SQL server and it's always constantly still going, it hits the registry and pushes that key out. So it's sometimes like a pain, right?
So the timing is important in this. Like when you get in to start doing forensics is important.
Our instruction is always to shut down those computers as fast as you can, specifically for Zeppelin. I'm not saying every one of them that's the best thing to do, but for us, because actually in many cases, memory analysis could be good for other things, but and keep the machine on, right? But the big vulnerability here was that 512-bit RSA keys can be factored by a distributed cluster of using a general number field sieve, and I'm not going to get into it, but it's basically 4-stage mathematics. You can pretty much on a CPUs, and I use like 100 CPU, like 100 computers with like 32 CPUs on each one off DigitalOcean, and essentially it takes like 4 hours to crack it. Right. So it could be cheaper if I want to go to GPU and AWS, but for some reason I just, needed to move on this. So we locate the deleted key. It's in that public key in cases like, when we saw with sometimes also on the malware itself, and that even makes it easier. Tools used, I modified YARP, which is yet another registry parser, some Python and some kind of ingenuity on the forensic side. And then the file location it's in is ntuser.dat, which is your registry. It's usually locked. That's why we have to give you like a Linux ISO boot disk to like get that file, because it's usually hard to grab. And if it doesn't exist, it's usually in the transaction log, which is also the .log file. So we usually ask for those as well. So locating the deleted key, this is a YARP view of it. But essentially in here, you see the public key at the top, and it's in base 64 and an encrypted private key. We can ignore the encrypted private key because there's no luck doing that, but that's actually a 2048-bit private. That's the actual key encrypted to the master key, which is uncrackable. But this public key is actually RC4. So the first 32 bytes of it is actually RC4, and then you can decrypt. So when you decode it, you can actually do you can see you grab the first character, 32 bytes, and then we have an RC key, 4 key. And I know that that's a stupid thing, but it's just for them to hide their information a bit. So using RC4 in Python, you can literally just grab it, and then you essentially end up getting this like number down here, which is N and E. I don't know why they use these long exponents when they could just use 65537, but whatever. Point being is that here you have a N, which is your modulus, your public key, and your E is your exponent, which is in RSA it's P. N equals P times Q, which is 2 numbers that we don't know, essentially 2 primes, and then that makes this, and the exponent is used to do a logarithmic exponential equation. So there's the actual key here, and then we get to work. So I'll show you exactly what we do. So cracking the keys, we have N. I pulled out, and those are hexadecimals, so you can convert them to numbers, or you can just put 0x in front of them. You got E, which is your exponent, and then when I run the general number field sieve, you'll get P and Q. If you multiply these P and Q's times together, N should equal the same number, the 0x, 1, 2, whatever, right? And so when you do that, you just do your RSA secret key. Again, I had at the time of testing this, I had 96 computers, but I've upped that nowadays for people who are in a hurry. But essentially, the more computers, the faster it gets done, but a little more pricey, right? And then we get that, and we solve the key. Now, this is kind of what the factoring looks like. If you have HTOP, and I had all these computers, so it was just a kind of a fun snapshot of what it actually looked like. When I was
so each of these little screens are different computers that you're running.
Yeah. So it was literally using screen. So the top ones are essentially all these processors that are running across multiple things. The little text in the middle is Cato NFS, which is the standard best number field sieve system out there, and it works nicely. If you want to do GPUs, I would look at MSIEV and a combination of Cato NFS and MSIEV, because there's parts that are distributed and parts that are not, and there's parts that GPUs can handle or not. With a GPU, though, I have seen a really cool thing where a 512-bit key can be cracked in 1 to 2 hours for $100, whereas on the CPUs, it can be $400 in 4 hours, right? About $100 an hour. So,
okay.
So So that's fun part. So decrypting the files, these are a little technical, but essentially, this is borrowed from Cylance, and I want to give them props, right? Because so when I read the article, the homeless thing, I was like, I saw the file, it said Zeppelin side. I went to the blog on this, and I read their whole report. It was amazing. That's why I give them props in the blog. But essentially, they helped me like have to not reverse engineer too much, because I'm like, oh, here's the file headers, footers. I wouldn't have to like sit there for another month trying to figure out how everything works. And so essentially how this actually works is that, let's go backwards though. So at the bottom here, if you go backwards, the first section here in red that says F305, that's actually the size of appended data, right? So that's the footer size, right? And then it has original file size, which is the next block here, right? And then essentially the next part is like, I'm going from the bottom to the top, the victim's private, size of data encrypt, and then victim's private asymmetrical T, and that's that whole red thing. The length of the next field is the next block here. And then there's the 32-bit RC4 followed by 8 encrypted 0 bytes. Now they technically, it's not 80 encrypted bytes. It's actually the offsets for the striping. So I did figure that out when I was doing the analysis, because I calculated the striping and figured it out. But then I was like, oh, wait, they match this footer. So you can just borrow it from the footer, making it so much easier. And then from that, you have a length of the field, next field, and things like that. So like essentially, this is like how they kind of do a footer. And this goes at the bottom of a thing. What this tells you though is it gives you the original file size, all the other things that they're going to need to decrypt, and it tells their decrypter to do that. So I wrote my own decryptor. The actual like original stuff, I'm putting this in Python, but like the original one I wrote in the actual like AES and stuff was in C, so that would be faster. But for calling it and everything like that. So the decryption, I have decrypt fields, right? I have to actually get all that stuff, the RC4, things like that. Load key IV. So AES's CBC mode is basically 16-byte IVs, and you have to have them padded correctly. So there's also padding if there's like missing it. So it pads with zeros, things like that. Kind of complicated when I first got there. It also does this thing where it has a 666 prepend. So it has a bang or exclamation point 666 at the beginning to validate, which helps us too, because it validates that this is actually decrypted properly, right? So, and then we just remove that prefix to it, and then the file can be restored. So this is like where we parse the footer, right? And then from that point, we then collect all the ciphertext. Remember, it's striping. So we actually have to like go through and grab all the ciphertext, and there's also all like plain text. So it's almost like we have to interweave. So we pull all the collect thing. It was kind of like you could actually draw this story out. So the stripe multiple offsets are essentially like stripe multiple original file size divided by basically 256 times 16. It's a whole process, and that basically just makes it an even number of like how they do their offsets, kind of standard. Right. And then from that point, we have the decryption gets started, the decrypt, and then we start with the decrypt file. Now there's interleaving on the left side. It's a little hard to see, but this actually, like we literally, when we decrypt, we have to put the data back in. So we have to actually take those collects, measure the offsets, and then weave in, and then take the file, put it back together. It's kind of a thing. And then the files are decrypted. This is kind of a picture of that. And then we actually, because I realized that I didn't want people spending $50,000 for me to do all of this work for them, because I felt like that was more than the ransom at the time, and ethically I don't want to do that. I decided to learn UI. And so I made a step-by-step decryptor so that the client can find the key, send it to us, we crack it, and then we can upload it back into...
I gotta say this. When I first contacted you, your first words were, rather than paying me to do this, why don't you try this first? And you pointed me to your Discord channel, right? And you know, we were trying to do it on your channel and things like that at that point. But I mean, eventually it was complex enough that, you know,
it was a new strain that actually did it differently. They didn't put it in the registry. That's why we.
That's right. So I think you know, all this to say was like, you know, definitely what you're saying is correct, because you're not in this for money. You really wanted to just give it out, and you do have publications on how to do it.
And then factoring is the only thing that really cost us, or obviously consulting time if you need. And this was a much more complicated process, but we still did it under a lot. We got a pretty good solid. The ransomware was huge, and this is like, you know, like less than 10%. So that's good. We just wanted to keep it ethically clear. So I did do UI, and now I like UI. UI is actually kind of fun. So So I want to talk about like real quick before we got to go, but like essentially ransomware file-based disruption. So I've had some theories looking at these files, and I'm sitting there going, why haven't we figured this out yet? Now, I'm not saying that I have the best answer either, but what I'm just saying is it just has confused me when we look at like, what's the commonalities that is always going to be existing in ransomware and maybe nothing else, right? Even if it is,
Right.
what's something that won't interfere with that nothing else and it's still valuable, right? So we go back to ransomware TTPs again, new process recursing all files. I've been working on this prototype. We're coming out with a Windows version soon to have testers. So if anybody wants to actually get on that Windows desktop testing, I'm also going to make a Fuse version for AWS and a few things. But essentially, in the recursing directories, we see this process recursing. So ransomware comes along and recurses the directory. I got a system driver that sits, and it's actually hardware protected. It actually sits in the BIOS, EFI and UEFI, so it essentially can't be seen in the OS. So it sits under the OS, like a ring negative one, I guess, right? And essentially, when on read, right, ransomware reads first, puts it in memory, and then it has to actually start the write and encryption. So on read, this system that I've got for the prototype actually creates a snapshot every time a file is read, and it deduplicates and all this other stuff. So like you don't have to worry about that. But essentially, in the moment, once they start encrypting, it doesn't matter to us. We don't care about the encrypted version. We get on the read before they encrypt. And then they restore and then we can simply just restore the file once closed, like it's on a secret hard drive. The OS can't even see, right? It's on and it's dynamically set up. So it's set for the common files that they would attack. But the cool part is that the ransomware would set up backup. This is basically making ransomware, setting up a backup. It causes a backup of your system. So in most days, how many files do you actually look at? And I'm not talking like cache and operating system. We don't have to care about that. But how many files do you open a day? Maybe like 30. 20, right? Yeah. So you get snapshots of those. So your hard drive's gonna be super small, right? Like that one that's like creating the snapshot, and it's low retention, so it'll move it in 3 days because you're gonna do new files tomorrow and this and that. It's only waiting for that ransomware to then start going and recursing. The minute it starts recursing and reading files, it starts doing this. The hard drive starts expanding the secret one, and then it'll start like snapshotting everything. And it only does it once and captures that, right? And has differentials and all this stuff, right? This is actually kind of how it works. So while this is the ransomware on the left, this is actually the thing that's snapshotting every time it's encrypted, right? So and then you can actually hit restore and it'll actually get files. So these are actually encrypted files. This is just a prototype. But essentially you'll see the encrypted files.
Vaccine.
It's a vaccine. So it sits in the background. It's not seen by the OS because we actually wrote it up at a higher level. And essentially, so there's no way unless you really want to be that technical and, but essentially it'll create the ransomware to be the backup system for you, which I think is probably the best approach because no one's going to hate a good backup. Cool. You know what I mean? So